right? And there are actually 235 million active users. 135 million active users in the stream. Now, at the same time, if you compare this to the billion users plus on Facebook, or the 300 million plus users on Twitter, it is smaller, but you can see the growth is happening in the network itself. So, from a general perspective, you are seeing, Google Plus really sort of start moving more into the mainstream. That data that we just talked about is sort of from the end user adoption. The next piece to look at is also kind of the adoption from the brand perspective, right? And in terms of the adoption of Google Plus by the brands, how many of these brands and marketers are leveraging Google Plus? And what we're seeing is actually very big adoption also on the brand marketing side. Right? The marketers for the brands are adopting Google Plus. In fact, if you look at that list that I just showed you, 75% of those brands now have Google Plus, active Google Plus profiles. Right? So we're seeing consumer adoption rise, as well as the brand marketers really starting to leverage Google Plus. So at the macro level, we are seeing this movement towards leveraging and adopting Google Plus. One of the other things that we track, right? So here we see the brands are adopting, the consumers are adopting. The next thing that we're looking at is how much interaction is happening between those end users and the brands. How much activity, how many followers are they getting? So we've been tracking this for the last 2.5 years or so. Right, so first year, in 2011, shortly after launch, a little under 250,000, right, 220,000 followers of those brands on Google+. 2012, there was a big push. You see that big surge, and by this year, roughly about a little over 20 million, almost 21 million followers on Google+. So roughly a 94x increase in followership. So again, lots of engagement starting to happen on Google+. However, one of the interesting things to note here is that a lot of that activity is actually happening, within the top 10 brands. So out of the top 10 brands account for 4 out of 5 followers, right? So just if you think about the shape of that adoption, it's the big brands that are leveraging it, out of the big brands that are leveraging it, they're getting a lot of the adoption of Google+. So brands like H&M, a lot of auto is getting good adoption of Google+. So let's kind of double click and drill down on some of that, right? So H&M is a good example. Right? If you look at their Google+ profile and what they're doing there, it's a great example of leveraging Google+. They've built out a very active Google+ page. They've built out a very clear strategy around how they're going to engage and leverage their content. They create content that's more exclusive to Google+, as opposed to typically what we see is more just republishing, right, of content into Google+. So they've applied a strategy that's more customized and unique to that. They're leveraging some of the more unique capabilities of Google+, like Hangouts, right? And so those are some of the key things. Auto industry is another great sort of set of examples. There's a lot of great adoption that's happening there. That's a vertical where you're seeing very good, strong early adoption there. There's a clear sort of path to purchase and social within that industry that makes it a really good fit. And so I'd really sort of encourage you to look at some of the examples within the auto industry in terms of the adoption of Google+. This is kind of a macro view of some of the best practices that they're using, right, in that industry. The first is really implementing social extensions, right, to enable better discovery. Then really sort of engaging, right, face-to-face, leveraging that unique capability with Hangouts to really interact with those customers. And then really turning those customers into communities with a community capability within Google+. And then last but not least is cross-promoting, right, that Google+ page with other channels. Right? So very basic but powerful ways to really start driving Google+ engagement. So that's a great example of an industry that's really leveraging Google Plus very well. One of the other things that's really important, up until this point, we've been kind of talking about the macro adoption of Google Plus, how customers are using it, and how the auto industry is using it. The other thing that's really important and interesting, right, is that Google Plus is now taking up more real estate on the search page. Right? So as a search marketer, this is a really important dimension. If you search for H&M, for example, one of the things that shows up that takes up that prime real estate on the right-hand side is the Google Plus content. And you have the ability, as you publish posts on Google Plus, to now leverage that real estate, right? And so that's a very important and powerful new way to really leverage Google Plus. Remember, back before this change, that real estate used to be dedicated to a lot of paid search real estate, right? On the right-hand side, top position, that's prime real estate on the search page. So clearly, a lot more integration of Google Plus directly into the search page, very important dimension to start really getting on top of and building your Google Plus presence. So, top 10 key takeaways. At the macro level, I showed a lot of stats around how Google Plus is going mainstream. From the consumer perspective, we talked a little bit about how 3 out of the top 4 brands, out of the top 100 brands, now have Google Plus presence and active Google Plus pages. We talked about the great growth that's been happening in terms of the number of followers, the 94x increase in followership. We also talked a little bit about, the changes in terms of, or the concentration that's still happening. That represents that there's still a lot of opportunity to really drive more engagement. If 4 out of the top 10 brands, the top 10 brands already represent or currently represent 4 out of 5 followers, that means there's a ton of opportunity to still engage with those Google Plus followers. We went through a couple examples of H&M, what they're doing. That's a great example to look at. The auto industry, how they're leveraging Google Plus, as well as we talked about how the evolution of the search page is going to really be a big driver of how those two channels come together, right? Just like in a lot of the sessions, you heard a little bit about how Twitter impacts the search results, how Facebook impacts the search results and the evolution of all that. Well, Google Plus is clearly having an impact on the evolution of the search page, and it's a critical area to really get on top of. Early and creative adopters will get to that early benefit. We believe this is like the early days of link building, right? Where if you build up strong domains, there's an early mover advantage that you can still build out in this channel. And then, really sort of, you really want to, fight sort of the natural inclination to be skeptical around Google Plus and sort of resist sort of adopting it, because in reality, we really believe that we're clearly seeing Google push this very aggressively into the search page. So it is going to be an important dimension, whether it's the real estate that we talked about for your brand terms, or how it's showing up in terms of integration with author, or how local packs are starting to get integrated into that, or how product pages will be sort of, it's kind of previewed some of that stuff, right? So clearly, major shift here, where Google Plus is going to be a hub of content, of organic content, that you have to make sure you manage, just like you manage organic search optimization. So with all that data, around what's happening in the market from a macro perspective, I wanted to kind of highlight 5 key tips, 5 key takeaways. The first is when you think about Google Plus, to start still to link it to your SEO strategy, right? It's still thinking about the keywords, thinking about the pages that are relevant for those keywords, right? Those keywords and pages translate into topics, right, and content that you drive engagement on from a social perspective, right? So that's still the starting place when you start thinking about Google Plus. You also really want to leverage the entire Google Plus ecosystem, right? So everybody's heard about Hangouts, right? Communities, these are important aspects, right? So it's not just about republishing content that you're already pushing onto other social channels. You want to really engage with relevant audiences. We have seen from the different customers that we've worked with, the audiences are slightly different between, or are different between Twitter, Facebook, and Google+. You tend to have a very different audience there. It tends to be a little more tech-savvy audiences, a little more early adopter audiences on Google+. And then optimize for search results, right? One of the really important reasons for what's making Google+ so relevant is obviously the impact that it's going to have on search results. So you want to understand what are the implications there in terms of how it's getting blended into the search page, whether it's how it's reshaping the real estate for branded search pages, all the way to how it's showing up in different search listings and providing more contextual information on those search listings being enriched by Google+ data. And then last but not least, you really want to start thinking about authorship, right? That is an important aspect. I know some of the other panelists are going to talk a little bit about that. That's another important aspect of what's happening with Google+. It's not just about building up a fan base. It's not just about building up followership. It's actually really building up authority within sort of your brand and your publishing. That's going to become a very important part of what we believe is going to be important assets to have as the SERP page gets sort of completely reshaped and as Google+ really drives search and social to come together. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth.